All this week, TVO has blanketed our primetime lineup with a special Mysteries of the Mind series of programs and documentaries. For our part, the agenda brought you 4 programs on topics ranging from how your lifestyle affects your brain health to what the intersection of technology and the mind might look like. The agenda's Week in Review now begins by making yourself and your brain smarter. The brain is the most complex organ of the body, and our knowledge of it is increasing rapidly. As scientists are mapping the connections in the brain, we are learning more and more about the brain's abilities. Joining us now to help uncover those abilities, in San Francisco, California, Michael Merzenich. He is a neurologist at the University of California. In Denver, Colorado, Nicholas Carr, author of The Shallows. And with us here in studio, Robin Green, University Health Network Canada Research Chair in Traumatic Brain Injury, and Jordan Peterson, clinical psychologist at the University of Toronto. It's great to have everybody, both here in the studio and points beyond, in our conversation tonight. We're so glad you could all join us. Okay, let's start with this. Michael, let's start with you in San Francisco. When we say smarter in terms of the brain, what are we actually talking about?
Well, the brain is subject to improvements of agility, or you could say variability in agility. Some brains are fast and generally accurate. Some brains are slow and generally inaccurate. And there's a wide range of ways that people have mastered the ability. You could say brains are capable of manipulating information in controlling their actions. And we identify a person that's good at manipulating information and controlling their actions in a highly flexible way as intelligent.
Robin, agility, manipulating information, anything you'd add to the list about what we mean when we say, boy, they got a smart brain in that head?
Sure. I think in addition to that, and something we're not that great at measuring, is much higher level functions we sometimes call meta-level abilities, like being self-aware, monitoring ourselves, setting a goal and implementing the goal. But we don't really capture that too well in our IQ tests.
Okay, Jordan, you want to pick up on that?
Well, some of the goal-setting abilities and the self-monitoring seem to be associated with conscientiousness, a trait, and it has no relationship whatsoever to intelligence. One of the things that wasn't really highlighted in the discussion of what SMART is so far is the capacity to learn, and to learn quickly, and then to apply that knowledge. Because there's sort of the brain as an organ that's capable of processing information, and then there's the brain as an organ that's capable of memory and the application of that knowledge to new situations. So sometimes that's called fluid and crystallized intelligence.
Okay, Michael, you referred to, I'm sorry, go ahead. You wanted to add?
Oh, I was just going to say that a brain that's very accurate at high speed with high accuracy is a brain that's very effective at recording information. And, you know, our understanding of things and the ability to manipulate information and the ability to control complex actions and reactions is dependent upon having a good encyclopedic recording of information. I mean, if we're not really capable of storing, recording information and keeping it in present mind in a powerful form, then we're not going to make much of it. So all of these things are complexly interrelated, of course.
Nicholas, I'm going to get you in here at this point because, of course, we've talked to you in the past about your book, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. And one of the things that you have talked about is your deep concern that our so-called digital culture is affecting our ability to think deeply or think critically. Just share your thesis with us, if you would.
Well, I think one thing we know about the brain, thanks to some of the research done by your other guests, is that it adapts to our environment. It adapts to the circumstances in which we think. And so if you consider what's happened in the past 5-10 years is we've really changed that environment. By introducing high-speed networked computers, we're constantly interacting with those devices, with those screens all the time, often from the moment we wake up until the moment we go to sleep. And I think that encourages us to think in a certain way, to take in lots of information very quickly, to multitask, to be kind of distracted or interrupted, and to be able to process those distractions and interruptions. But I think what the environment, what this new digital environment doesn't encourage us to do and doesn't allow us to practice is more contemplative ways of thinking, the ability to screen out distractions and think deeply and conceptually about information, which I think is naturally hard for us to do. We seem to crave distractions. And so I worry that we're losing our ability to control our thoughts and to control our attention. And as that happens, we also kind of lose our ability to think conceptually and deeply and think at a very high kind of big picture level. Jordan, do you see this in your work? Is this a concern for you?
Well, I haven't seen this sort of thing manifest itself in the clinical environment. Like, I mean, I think those are interesting ideas, and it is a danger. Contemplation and imagination and play have their utility, and those are things that are best done in the absence of external stimulation. And I do see, say, among my kids, how much time they spend interacting with computer screens. They do teach them to be very organized, though, because you have to be organized to keep a computer running. And they teach them to be fast. And so it isn't clear to me exactly what the end consequence of that is going to be, so I wouldn't say I'm worried about it.
Okay, Robin, let me get you to weigh in on that as well. On the one hand, computers can enhance the brain's functions and activity. On the other hand, Nicholas has made the point that it can be making us stupider at the same time.
Right.
He didn't say it that way. I'm colloquializing a little bit there.
We were just talking about the definition of intelligence, and a part of what intelligence is negotiating our environment, and one could say that the internet is our environment. But I worry a little bit about issues around distractibility. I think my lens is around reward, and what concerns me a bit is that the internet is feeding a need for a lot of reward, much more frequent reward than maybe out there in the real world. So for example, if I want to learn how to play an instrument, I need to put in hundreds or thousands of hours to achieve mastery, and there's not a whole lot of reward intermittently.
Until you get to the finish line.
Until you get to the finish line. So making that leap is maybe a challenge.
I heard somebody from out of town trying to get in. Michael, was that you?
Yeah, can I weigh in on this a little bit?
Please.
The average kid in our nation, my nation and yours, spends 10 or 11 hours a day looking at a screen. And what does that really mean? It means that they're largely absorbing information. When they're on the internet, that's a sort of favorable time for looking at a screen in the sense that they're reacting to it and they're acting on it on some level. But a large part of their interaction with media is only emotionally reactive, you could say. I mean, they're taking in information visually and emotionally. You know, we're really constructed, our neurology is constructed to make decisions about things in action. We're not really meant to be sitting in a chair 10 or 11 or 12 hours a day with our body largely disengaged, with our brain substantially disengaged except as an emotional receiver. And of course that matters. Of course it makes a difference. And a kid on the internet who learns to solve every problem by looking up answers is different from an individual who aggressively and on a heavy schedule reasons to answers. Of course, there are massive differences in the schedule of way brains are engaged, and you could say there are advantages to both. I mean, what a wonderful thing to have the resources of the internet at our convenience, to have the information in such a way to be able to pile it into our brain, to manipulate it in all kinds of ways. We can't manipulate it unless we have it. But on the other hand, you have to understand, people have to understand that the habits of brain use are different, and that the average brain of a child or adult now is very different from the average brain of a child or adult 20 years ago, 50 years ago, certainly 100 years ago, massively different. We're very different, in a sense, creatures, because our brains are plastic, and of course they're shaped by these heavy schedules of use.
It depends to some degree, too, the effect of this on what you compare it to. You know, so kids are sitting in front of the internet 10 or 11 hours a day, say, but, you know, 30 years ago they were sitting in front of televisions for approximately the same amount of time. And I would say that the interactive nature of the internet and its capacity to disseminate broad information and to teach you skills is something that's certainly preferable to television. But we should also note that television seems to have been an entity that on average improved the intelligence of the population. Now, it might be that watching television wasn't good for a kid who could have been reading Shakespeare, but it was really good for say, a 4-year-old who would have otherwise been stuck in a crib looking at the bars of the crib. So I think determining what the consequences of these sorts of things are is something that might be better managed at a sort of more micro level of analysis.
Mental activity outside awareness is what Norman Doidge says. What do you say?
Well, I think defining the unconscious is very difficult, just as it is to define consciousness. I mean, with consciousness, all we can say is it's first-person subjective experience. And unconscious is everything that happens in the brain outside of awareness. So you can have the unconscious, which is meaningless. You can have meaningful unconscious, which goes on to affect behavior. And you can have the emotive unconscious, or what we could call the classic psychodynamic unconscious, which goes on to motivate us in terms of our behavior and the way we interact with the world.
Dr. Georg Nordhoff, what would you add to that?
I would add that it is spontaneous and automatic. Spontaneous meaning we cannot avoid it. It goes continuously on by itself, and it's automatic. Basically, there are certain mechanisms and principles that occur by default on the psychological level as well as most likely on the neuronal level.
And Dr. Gauss, would you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I would certainly say from the clinical perspective, I think sometimes we get confused. I see that with my patients when we talk about conscious and unconscious. I think it's more a continuum of where we need to be in awareness. It's a focus, such as, you know, when my tummy is hungry, it tells me it's hungry. Otherwise, I'm not aware of it. Because I'm busy with other things. But the tummy becomes very important when I'm hungry because it tells me I need some nutrition. Otherwise, I'm not going to continue to function. And I think in that context, it's a little bit different from what our colleagues are saying here, just from the pure scientific perspective.
Let's give a sort of a hard and fast example here. Dr. Berlin, to you first, and tell me if we've sort of got things figured out here. If you're driving your car home from work, you get home. You don't actually remember anything about the drive on the way home because let's say you were listening to the radio and you were very deeply involved in whatever, the song you were listening to on the radio. Did your unconscious drive you home?
Well, I think much of what we do throughout the day is being driven, so to speak, by the unconscious. Because if you think about it, to be consciously aware of something, it takes a lot of let's call it energy, and it's capacity limited. So if you had to be consciously aware of all of the stimuli in your environment throughout the day, it would be overwhelming and it would be maladaptive. So a really great sort of conclusion of evolution is that much of how we interact with the world must go on, it's being processed by the brain, but outside of conscious awareness, because the unconscious has a greater capacity to hold information. So we're only aware, as you know, it's been said many times before, of just the tip of the iceberg. And much of what we do when you're navigating the streets of New York, walking, doing very complex tasks, much of it is way outside of awareness. And if it was in your conscious awareness, it actually would mess the behavior up. You wouldn't be able to do it as efficiently.
And Dr. Nordhoff, help us understand why it's important to appreciate the distinction between what you consciously do and what you unconsciously do. Why does it matter?
Let me come back to your driving home example. I think if you just bought the house new and you don't know your way home yet, then you will have to recruit your consciousness. Then you will not be able just to drive home while listening music. If you have that home since 15 years and you know basically the way home by heart, then you can almost drive by unconscious. And that means that your unconscious encodes and somehow ingrains in certain patterns of information. And ultimately the distinction, coming back to the clinical example, between conscious and unconscious is really a matter of degree. It's not a pure all or nothing dichotomy as Freud originally envisioned, but probably just a matter of degree, stronger conscious or a little bit more unconscious. And that's, I think, the way also what you can see in clinical psychiatry.
In which case, Dr. Gauss, does that mean, let's say you've lived in this house for 15 years and you can pretty much let your unconscious drive you all the way home because you know the way. Does that mean if our unconscious performs some of those functions in our life, it frees up, if you like, space for our conscious to do more and better things?
Oh, absolutely, because it's like being on autopilot in one area while we are paying attention in another area. It's almost like, you know, having your GPS in your car. You're unaware of the satellites that are up there that are guiding you. So you can pay your full attention to what the GPS is telling you what to do, while in the back office, if we could call it that, the satellites are keeping the GPS on track.
So it makes sense, Dr. Berlin, to really make a distinction between what the conscious and the unconscious do then. Is that fair to say?
Well, again, I think it's not black and white. There's sort of a gray area between conscious and unconscious processing. And I think the more we understand about it at the neural level, the more we can make better distinctions between the two. But for now, it's just a subjective state. You simply ask a person, were you aware or were you not aware? And sometimes it's very gray. And sometimes it has to do with signal detection. You know, what percentage of a chance that the person will be aware of detecting something in their environment?
We hear a lot, and Georg, let me go to you on this. We hear a lot these days about, you know, these very sophisticated fMRIs, which do brain imaging and map out all sorts of things about the brain. When you do that, does that include the unconscious brain?
I think any kind of neuronal activity we observe in fMRI, like the colorful dots and spots, which are often shown, always include a certain portion of unconscious activity. We cannot avoid it. I mean, exactly as my colleague said, any kind of conscious activity builds upon the unconscious and somehow interacts with this automatic ongoing processing in the background. So in the same way, when you look on your GPS, you cannot avoid that all the satellites pick up all the information, because this is basically the very basis for any kind of signal you watching by full awareness in the GPS. And that's the same way what happens in the brain. What we observe is probably a very crude mixture between conscious and unconscious activity. And the good scientist, and we are trying to work on this, is trying to experimentally distinguish the two. But probably from the perspective of the brain, we always have sort of a mixture between the two. As I said, there's probably a neuronal continuum between the two.
Bill O'Hanlon, thank you for your patience. I think we've got things fixed now. You've heard us discussing a number of different things, so why don't you just pick up on something you've heard and continue?
Well, I think that, you know, I think maybe a better word for what we're talking about is non-conscious. You know, unconscious gets confused with you're knocked out. So I think that's first, maybe a little change in terminology. And there is a certain kind of non-conscious awareness that we have when we're asleep. We don't roll off the bed. We figure out where the edges of the bed are. But where I think what Dr. Deutsch was talking about in our introduction is that there's a shifting view of this non-conscious material, and that is what some of the other panelists were talking about. It can either be helpful, like driving you home automatically and you paid attention to the other traffic, or it can be unhelpful. And so there are automatic patterns, I think that's been mentioned before, but some of those automatic patterns are helpful and some aren't. And I'll just give a quick example if I may. That is, I had a friend who's a physician, quite, you know, functional, and she went to take piano lessons, and it turned out that her mother had taught her piano when she was younger, and whenever she made a mistake, her mother would slap her on the head quite hard. And so she stopped taking piano lessons from her mother. She hated it. But 50 years later, she's 59 years old, and she goes to take piano lessons, and the piano teacher can't teach her after a while because she keeps flinching every time she makes a mistake. Even though she knows where it came from, that pattern is automatic, and it's not very easily changeable, and she's using it in a context in which it doesn't work. That's a little different from what Dr. Deutsch was talking about. Because we have some of these non-conscious patterns automatic, we can use them. For example, I wear glasses, but I don't notice that I have my glasses on my face after the first day or two after I get a new pair of glasses. And that I use with hypnosis, as I'm sure Jacques does, to help people remove their awareness of pain. We have that as an ability to not notice something when it's there all the time. And so it's the functional non-conscious automaticity versus the dysfunctional or non-functional.
We call it exercise for the brain. So you are monitoring brain waves. When the brainwave pattern shows that the person is calm and focused, then a game works. So it's nice, simple, fun, display audio and visual feedback, and then they know that their brain's doing the right thing. So they finally learn what it feels like to pay attention.
And Ed, what's the trick to getting somebody into that calm, focused place? How do you do that?
Well, the feedback is actually a major part of that. It works like the speedometer would on your automobile. Without the speedometer, it would be difficult to know if you were going too fast or maybe if you were slowing down and going too slow. But with the speedometer, you know that it gives you an immediate feedback signal about whether or not you're increasing your speed or decreasing your speed. So the feedback does the same thing for the person to know that the activity in their brain is speeding up too much or slowing down too much. And so it helps them be able to get into the range where they have the calm focus.
And what kind of success rates are you having?
The success rates are really very, very good. I went into this, much like Linda was saying, I went into this as a complete skeptic. Was very impressed with the additional benefit because we were already practicing, had clinical practice, we're already working with these populations. The increase in outcomes is what really made us switch over to essentially being a neurofeedback-based practice now. Instead of it being something that we add on to the treatment, it really is the center part of the treatment.
Linda, I don't think this is widely known. There are other treatments that have a lot more attention and space sort of in the public's mind than this one. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is?
Well, the most widely used intervention for attention deficit disorder is medication.
Right.
And in the US, they have 3.5 million children taking medication. So there is a profit motive for drug companies to create this industry around ADHD and have more children taking medication. And medications have a positive response rate of about 75%, though sometimes you'll have to try different meds to find one they respond to. Neurofeedback, on the other hand, has a success rate that's above 90%. If you should do it carefully, but if you do, and if they train long enough, it actually has a higher success rate. And the other advantage is, well, no negative side effects, and your results last. So there have been follow-ups, 10-year follow-up published in 1995, a very rigorous 2-year follow-up done in Europe, published more recently, that show that once you've trained the brain and it's made a shift towards a more mature pattern, those results last.
Ed, can I get your view on whether you think there's an interest by Big Pharma in keeping this quiet so that they can make greater profits?
I'm not sure they're doing much to actively squelch it. I think it's more that they have the means to be able to publicize. There's a lot of money spent to advertise medications. In fact, there's more money spent to advertise them than there is to develop them. So the educational programs that are done in professional settings are often supported by the pharmaceutical companies. So it's really, I think it's much more through the promotion of the drugs, and we really don't have the means of doing that with neurofeedback. We don't have the money to be able to do the type of marketing and educational programming that they do.
Well, speaking of money, we have some sense about how much it costs to put a child on whatever drug is required to deal with ADD or ADHD for an extended period of time. How would you compare that to the costs of doing neurofeedback?
Well, the studies that have been done show neurofeedback actually ends up being cheaper because the medicine only works while it's in your system. The brain doesn't learn anything from taking the medicine, different from neurofeedback. And as Linda was pointing out, the results from the neurofeedback tend to be there in one study at least for 10 years later. So there's no reason to assume that 15 or 20 years would make a difference if they're there 10 years later. And the medicine works while it's in your system. And then when it's out of your system, your brain is in exactly the same state as it was before you took the medicine.
Ironically, I mean, we've heard in other examples on the program, a lower cost may actually derive less buy-in. We've seen that with some other things. Has that been part of the difficulty here as well, Linda, you think? Because it's cheaper and therefore a bit more of an impediment to its acceptance?
Well, sometimes the high-tech toys have a little more cachet to them. So for example, there was a conference, a brain science conference here in Toronto, and they had a talk on neurofeedback. But they didn't have the talk given by someone who does the regular neurofeedback that's inexpensive using EEG monitoring. they had someone from Wales who does fMRI neurofeedback. So you're using $1 million machine that costs about $2,000 every scan to do your feedback, and that was highlighted. So, which is fine, because if you can do it in the high-tech way and show success, then to me it's common sense that you might use the less expensive equipment, you know, $10,000 equipment rather than $1 million equipment to derive the same results.
I don't get it, because we're spending $50 billion a year on healthcare in Ontario, and apparently we are always searching for equally effective but cheaper ways to treat people.
Right.
This sounds like it's a more effective, cheaper way to treat people, and yet it's not in the spotlight the way some of the other treatments are.
Right.
How come?
Well, I do think in the 21st century that biofeedback will finally come into its own, because it is cost effective and the results can last. So it makes sense. So initially you've got an upfront cost, and it's not a quick fix, right? So you have to train the brain. We do 40 sessions of training. Takes about 5 months. They come twice a week. So you have to be willing to let the brain change and wait for those effects, as opposed to medications where you will see the results within an hour.
I wonder, Ed, if that's not part of the problem, is that we're in a bit of a culture nowadays where when something goes wrong, find me a pill, tomorrow I'll start taking it, and then it's done.
Yes, absolutely. And I do think that, as Linda was pointing out, I think we're seeing that begin to transition, though. Where we haven't had much interest in the past in neurofeedback in major research universities, at least in the U.S., we are beginning to see a greater interest in it. I think some of the limitations of medication are being recognized, and some of the risks of medications are being recognized. The longest publicly funded study that's been done on ADHD, looking at medication, has found that the benefits of the medication really are not permanent, that after a couple of years there's really not much difference in the children who are medicated and the children who weren't medicated. That hasn't been the case with neurofeedback. So I do think that there's a growing awareness of alternatives and self-regulation approaches that neurofeedback is going to be in a good position to get more exposure than it has.
And Ed, let me ask this follow-up, which is, so far we've been talking about people with problems using neurofeedback. Right. And I wonder whether or not you think people with perfectly healthy brains, whether this is an option for them for improving cognition and other brain-related issues.
Certainly, there's a whole subset of folks in neurofeedback who do peak performance training or optimizing brain functioning, because most of us are not optimizing our brain functioning. A lot of that has to do with the demands that we face now are so much higher, and the demands on our attention. What used to be sufficient attention to function quite well is being taxed now just by the number of things impinging on our attention. So most people could benefit from improved self-regulation and certainly focus training.
Well, let me ask you, Linda, to give an example of somebody who, well, he's forever going to go down in the history of this country as a legend, because he was the first Canadian ever to win a gold medal at the Olympics on home soil for Canada, and that's Alexandre Bilodeau, the freestyle skier. What was he doing with neurofeedback that I guess you say helped him?
Well, before the last Winter Olympics in Vancouver, there were two groups of Canadian athletes who got neurofeedback and biofeedback training. One was the freestyle skiers, including Alexandre Bilodeau, and the other were the short track speed skaters. And they both did very well at the Games.
You think there's a connection?
And, well, after the Games, then it was revealed that this had been part of the Own the Podium program. And he was quoted in Maclean's magazine as saying that this training decreased his tension and improved his focus.
As we age, so does our brain. And joining us now to help discern what can be done to ensure brain health from cradle to grave. In San Francisco, California, Martha Herbert. She's a pediatric neurologist and neuroscientist at Mass General Hospital at the Harvard Medical School. In Naples, Florida, David Perlmutter. neurologist and fellow of the American College of Nutrition and the author of The Grain Brain. In Boston, Massachusetts, John Ratey, clinical professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. And with us here in studio, Tiffany Chow, behavioral neurologist at the Sam and Ida Ross Memory Clinic at Baycrest Health Sciences. I want to bring this list up here, 6 ways to make your brain healthier. Exercise 1, normal weight 2, healthy diet 3, don't smoke 4, limit the alcohol use, moderation 5, and avoid neurotoxins 6. Let's go around our literal and metaphorical table here and just say, if you had to pick one of these things to improve your brain health, which is the most important one? Martha Herbert, why don't you start us off in San Francisco?
Well, I'm going to be contentious here. I refuse to pick just one. I think you really have to optimize your entire lifestyle to get best health outcomes for your brain.
We're off to a wonderfully contentious start. Okay, David Perlmutter, how do you want to respond to that?
Well, let me respond then, if I could, to Martha. And I didn't know we'd get to have 2 votes, but I think I'm going to go back to 1 vote, and that would be exercise. And there's no question that exercise paves the way for brain preservation and protection. So I'm going to stick to the rules here, but I'll probably break them later on.
Well, I'm interested in that answer because Grain Brain being the title of your book, I would have thought healthy diet was #1, but you surprise us a bit with exercise.
No, without a doubt. I think that aerobic exercise through its what we call epigenetic activity, in other words, turning on specific parts of DNA to code for a specific chemical that's so dreadfully important for brain health, in my opinion, far outweighs really everything else in terms of its importance. Now, no question in terms of damaging effects on the brain, diet is critical, but I really think for purposes of education that the listening audience really needs to know that the most powerful supplement of all is really aerobic exercise, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about that later on.
We certainly shall. John Ratey, what would you put of those 6 at the top of the list?
Well, I would agree with Dr. Perlmutter that it is exercise is #1, but also with Martha, I think that healthy diet is equally important. But lots and lots of evidence has been accrued over the years looking at exercise and its effect on pushing back cognitive decline in Alzheimer's disease. The Mayo Clinic's reviewed over 1,600 papers last year and saw looking at the effect of exercise in delaying cognitive decline and finding them all very positive in their findings. So that we know that exercise does so much in the brain to make us optimize our behavior, optimize our feeling state, and make our cognitive apparatus work optimally.
Tiffany Chow, what's the view from Baycrest?
I would say that I'm going to put on the board, on the scoreboard, the neurotoxins, especially the neurotoxin that comes from within, cortisol. If we could all learn how to manage our stress better from an early age and continue that through the lifespan, I think that impacts a lot of the other things on the list, but cortisol is one of those things that's toxic to your hippocampus, which is a memory center. It's a memory center in the brain, and it is the epicenter of damage in Alzheimer's disease. So if we can bolster it, support it, make it big and fluffy throughout our lives, then reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease.
How are you defining neurotoxins? Give us some examples.
Good question. Neurotoxins are those things that once your brain is exposed to them will cause shrinkage or death of neurons. We want to keep all those neurons. We want to keep them happily connected and communicating with each other. So some of the classic neurotoxins would be heavy metals, lead, mercury poisoning. Other neurotoxins have to do with organophosphates, things that can lead to other neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's disease.
John Ratey, I think everybody understands the connection between you exercise, your body feels and gets better. I'm not sure everybody gets the connection between you exercise and your brain gets better. You want to make that connection for us?
Sure. Well, think about this. When we were hunter-gatherers for 500,000 years, our brains evolved and developed to make us better movers. We used those same nerve cells that evolved over that period of time to think, to be cognitive, those are the cells that make us most human. So that by exercising, we activate those cells. And the brain we think of now as a muscle. So the more we use it, the better it is. You have everybody out there doing Sudoku and learning a new language as we age, to use our brains more. And we know that activity is important. But in exercise, we're using more of our brain cells than in any other activity that we know of. And this all creates a lot of good stuff. Dr. Perlmutter referred to a substance that I call miracle grow for the brain, or BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And every time we exercise, we make more of that stuff than in any other situation that helps keep our hippocampus fluffy and growing. So, and that's the thing. We really want our brains to continue to grow.
I can see the theme of this program is going to be keeping your hippocampus fluffy. Got it. I'm learning.
So what are you doing when you're offline, but your brain's still on? And what you're doing during sleep is a certain amount of, there's getting rid of the garbage, as Martha was saying, but there's also taking the stuff that you want to keep, memories, information, and cross-referencing it, refiling it, consolidating, so that you can remember better later. This also happens in terms of physical wayfinding, as well as some of the exercise that you do. So if you ever noticed that you were really clumsy at a particular new task, but then the very next time you tried it without rehearsing in between, you were actually more on the mark. This is because something's going on in your brain during sleep that makes you better, more skilled, more practiced, because in there, overnight, you've been practicing backwards how to get back to the place that you started from. If you're in a maze, they're really cool things that happen during sleep. So you're hurting yourself in more ways than one if you don't get enough sleep.
If you don't get enough sleep. Huh.
Let me jump in here. That
Please.
article talked about the adults and the workforce, 80% having a sleep deprivation, but our kids, I think it's even greater, and it's not just in the U.S., it's around the world. Our kids are chronically sleep deprived, most of them, either because they're working so hard to get better grades, or they're addicted to their digital universe. And we all are. And this is one of the reasons that we really are losing sleep. And it's so important because sleep and exercise and diet all interact with one another. Sleep will help lower your blood sugar. Exercise will help you sleep longer and better. All these things work together, and we need to go back to what Martha said. She wanted to adopt all the 6 ways of lifestyle change to help us live better, adding sleep in and adding what we call vitamin C, or connection, being connected to others, to people, to small groups, is also very important for us to lower the stress, to have us, our brains work better.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety. They're on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.